Session number 75. Doesn't that make this the Jubilee or something? We should have confetti dropping down from the ceiling and something fun, right? But instead, we're just going to dive right in. You know, incidentally, somebody asked me, it was social media. I saw just yesterday or today that a preacher was asking in an exegetical preaching group online whether or not it was a good thing to have a title for a sermon. And it was an evangelical group, so of course the answers were, why in the world would you ask such a question? Of course a sermon has to have a title. My goodness, what are you going to put on the marquee? To my response was, what's wrong with session number 75? That's a good title, isn't it? So here we are at session number 75 in our look at God's revelation of transition. Acts chapter 25 is where we are on the home run stretch, getting up to Acts chapter 28. And we start down in verse 13. You may remember that in the first part of the chapter, we had a new governor of the province, and that was Festus. And Festus had a little, hearing. We won't call it a trial, a little hearing with Paul. And Paul decided he would go to see the Caesar and appeal to Caesar. And so Festus talked with his legal counsel and said, well, he's appealed to Caesar he shall go. And that's where we left off last time. Now, beginning again in chapter 25, let's see. Let's start in verse 13. So we left off last week in verse 12. You appeal to Caesar, and to Caesar shall you go. Verse 13 then says, and after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice came to Caesarea to salute Festus. Now, I want to stop for just a moment and speak about Bernice and Agrippa, because there's some interesting people. I noticed on your outline there it says verse 1, that is verse 13. But in verse 13, we have Agrippa, the king. He is the Jewish king from the time Jesus was born up until this time, Jesus being born again about 1 BC, and now we're up to about 62 AD, so we've had 60 plus years take place. And in that time, the kingdom had changed. It had been under Rome the entire time, but the governance had changed it a little bit. Even from the time Jesus was born, in which you have Herod the king, who seems to be the only guy there is. He certainly is answering to the Caesar, but we don't see much of the Caesar other than Caesar Augustus took a census of all the inhabited earth, and everyone went to register for the census. We see that aspect of the Romans. But even by the time Jesus dies, Jesus doesn't go before the king of the Jews. Jesus is tried as being the king of the Jews, and Jesus goes before Pilate, who is the Roman procurator. Now, procurators, proconsuls, governors, we're not going to get into all the difference. There's a little bit of shade of difference between this one and that one. But at this point, you have Festus, who, let's call him the Roman governor. He really is doing the bulk of the work, but there is still this Jewish king that's a puppet king, if you will, and his name is Agrippa. Now, this happens to be Herod Agrippa II. Here he's just called Agrippa, but we know he is Agrippa II. That means there was an Agrippa I, right? Exactly. Agrippa I we already had back in Acts chapter 12. And there, let's put a date on Acts chapter 12 just a little bit using our Schofield Bible, 44 AD. 42 to 44. So 20 years earlier, there was Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I was the son of Herod the Great. So this guy here, back in Acts chapter 25, verse 13, this King Agrippa is Herod Agrippa II. His dad put James to death. His dad then very much was aware of Peter and James and their kingdom gospel and the work of the Jews and this sect of the Nazarenes, as it was called, the Way, as it's often called in the book of Acts. His dad knew all about it. His dad, I may have misspoke there. I can't remember what my brain said. If I said he put Peter to death, I didn't mean that. He imprisoned Peter, and the angel came and let Peter out. But he put James to death, imprisoned Peter, and he is the one, the dad, by the way, Agrippa I, Herod the Great's son, he is the one that died from the worms. You may remember when he didn't give the glory to God, and he had that horrible death in Acts chapter 12. Now, this is his son that comes to us in chapter 25. Agrippa and Bernice. Now, just in case you are ever on Jeopardy and they say, who is the wife of Agrippa II? You'll say, I've been in the Sunday school class, and so I know it is not Bernice. This happens to be Agrippa, who comes with Bernice. But Bernice is his sister, not his wife. Technically. Now, let me finish talking about Agrippa here for just a moment. It's interesting that Josephus actually gives quite a bit of information about Agrippa. Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian, Flavius Josephus, he spends a fair amount of time on this Agrippa II. Possibly and probably because Herod, of course, is writing about the main subject of Herod is the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. The Jewish revolt, the Romans come in, AD 70, all that kind of stuff is a big chunk of Josephus's writing. Well, this Agrippa is the one that happened to be the king during the Jewish revolt. Typically, as I said, I believe last week, the Jewish revolt, we say that it started in 66 AD. Here we are again, probably 60, Schofield uses the date of 62 AD. So we're within 3 or 4 years of the Jewish revolt starting. Agrippa is going to be the king all the way up through the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, or the destruction of the Jewish nation by the Romans. So there's good reason that Josephus talks about him. One of the things Josephus does is he includes actually the transcript, if you will, of a speech that Agrippa gave to the Jewish people. And his speech to the Jewish people is all about why they should not revolt against the Romans. And, you know, it's interesting reading. It's a little bit of political expediency. We're going to lose this thing if we revolt, and so we shouldn't do it. We should go along to get along. And it's a little bit that if you are the king of the Jews, you have to do the bidding of the Romans. And so he's doing the bidding of the Romans there, trying to calm it all down. Now, at first, Agrippa and Bernice, his sister, really kind of align with the Jews in the revolt. They had a sympathy in the revolt. They just politically didn't want to happen. By the end, they ended up completely turning and aligning with the Romans. And this Agrippa right here ended up at the destruction of Jerusalem. He ended up moving to Rome, lived out the rest of his life, which was another 30 years. He died, we believe, about 100 AD. So he's got a lot of history with him. Now, Bernice is his sister. However, they were always together. And there were rumors in the National Enquirer that Agrippa and Bernice had an incestuous relationship. Herod, the line he uses is rather, not Herod, Josephus, the line that Josephus uses is rather interesting. He said that a report went that she had criminal conversation with her brother. That's his way of glossing it all over. There was rumors of criminal conversation. Now, he uses conversation there. It's translated as conversation in terms of lifestyle, like the King James uses lifestyle conversation. So, criminal activity between her and her brother is basically what it says. And then he ties that with, because this report, to quote again, report went out of criminal conversation with her brother, immediately after that he says, therefore she found this fella, arranged a marriage, and they got married, and it was a politically arranged marriage just to keep the newspapers happy, is what it was. So Josephus tells us all about that, also known as Peyton Place. That is the Herod Agrippa II that we're looking at here. And Bernice that come again in verse 13. So after certain days, King Agrippa and his sister Bernice came to Caesarea to salute Festus. And, verse 14, when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's cause unto the king, saying, there's a certain man left in bonds by Felix. Remember, Felix, the governor before Festus, had been kicked out by the Romans because he was crooked. And you had to be pretty crooked to be kicked out by the Romans, but he was. And here, Festus kind of throws Felix under the bus a little bit, because that was a long time ago, and Festus could have freed the guy, but Festus didn't free him either. And so, Felix brought him in. Here he is, still got him. Verse 15, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have a judgment against him, to whom I answered, that is, I answered the Jews, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that which he is accused before that, he which is accused have the accusers face to face, to have license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay, on the morrow I sat down on the judgment seat and commanded this man to be brought forth. Okay, that was last week's lesson. He's just summarizing last week's lesson here, is that, the guy was in prison. I went down, or the Jews wanted me to take him to Jerusalem for a trial. Remember, the Jews were going to kill him on the way, but they wanted me to take him to Jerusalem on a trial. I said, no, that's not the way we do it. We have the trial here, and so be happy to bring him before the judgment seat. I sat down on the judgment seat, on the bema, as we talked about last week, and because he's on the bema seat, I would just say he could have made a judgment. He didn't make the judgment. What he said, and pardon me if I'm going to repeat myself in a little bit in the verses as he rehearses that, but what he said is, hey, I don't know, seems to be some religious matter. Why don't we go to Jerusalem and have a trial? And Paul says, no, I'll appeal to Caesar. Festus really kind of drug this thing out, never did his job, and ended up then where Paul really doesn't have much choice other than to appeal to Caesar, and so that's exactly what he got. And so Festus here is kind of explaining his actions against Paul, or with Paul. One of the things that, again, you see, and I've mentioned this the past several weeks, is that you could really use the book of Acts to teach Western civilization. Do they teach that anymore? Western Civ? Remember we used to take that? I don't know if they teach it anymore. They don't seem to like it anymore. But here, verse 16 again, it is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die before that he is able to, before that which is accused, have the accusers face to face to have license to answer for himself of the crime laid against him. So he basically says, hey, there's this rule of law, and the law says you face your accusers. That, by the way, I think is one of the fundamental aspects of Western thinking and Western society and Western civilization, is that you have the right to face your accusers. And when it comes to court, very, very few exceptions in which the person that's making the charge against you is not there right in front of you. When they give their testimony, they have to look at you with you looking back at them. And when you give your testimony, the same way. It's not this kind of, we have a session here for the accused and a session over here for the accuser, all in the same room looking at each other. It's kind of an uncomfortable moment, as you can imagine, which that in and of itself, I think, helps to make sure that you don't bring a charge that is frivolous. I think, by the way, that we ought to just make that a practice in our personal lives. We don't sit on the judgment seat, but if we're going to accuse someone, we ought to know that there's enough to the accusation to be able to look them in the whites of their eyes and make the accusation right then and let them respond to the accusation. And in churches or wherever it is, I think we ought to have that kind of public forum to say, hey, if Bob has something against Susie, then face to face. This is the way we do it biblically in our society, and certainly the Roman society was there. So, some foundations to Western thought right there, the right to face your accusers. Verses 18 and 19 then, he continues, and he said, against whom, this is Paul, against whom, when the accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed. Now, that's kind of interesting. I suppose Festus is thinking, they are going to accuse him of breaking a law, a Roman law. After all, they want him dead. So what is the charge against him? And even Jesus, they brought the charge against him. It says he's a king of the Jews. Are you the king of the Jews? And this was the insurrection, basically, was the charge against Jesus. So here, Festus is saying, okay, they're going to bring some charge. You are you killed somebody, you stole something, you were speeding. You're going 75 in a 60 zone, whatever it is. There's a charge against you, and he's expecting some of that. But he says they brought none of the accusations of such things as I suppose. Now, I said last week, and I'll reiterate it here, I think all along Festus thinks Paul is innocent, and Festus knows that he ought to be dismissed. Unfortunately, dismissal of the innocents was not a part of the Roman government, and you remember Pilate, I see no wrong in the man, but wash my hands of it, let you all do what you want. Political expediency came in. I think we see here, again, Festus is showing us, first of all, that there's not any substantive charges against Paul. If there were, it would have come out. And it doesn't. But it goes on to say, verse 19, so there wasn't any accusations like I suppose, verse 19, but the Jews had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Okay. They didn't charge him like I thought they were going to charge him. It was a religious matter, basically. They had these superstitions about resurrection, and specifically about Jesus. Now, here we do learn in verses 1 through 12 that we studied last week, when Paul was actually before Festus. Luke didn't give a lot of the details, so we didn't know exactly what they were talking about here. We suspected that Festus thinks he's innocent, and here I think we pretty much have the confirmation of that. He hasn't broken any law, but he's guilty of believing in the resurrection. Now, when Paul was before Felix, we saw this where Paul said, I am being put on charge for the same thing that my fathers believed in, and that was the resurrection of the dead. Now here we see that with Festus must have also been that discussion, in addition to it centering around Jesus. Because again, verse 19 it says, of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. So in all of that, Paul must have testified of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We know from Felix again, he spoke generally of the resurrection. Now we know that he must have spoken specifically of the resurrection of Jesus as the first fruits of the dead. So here's the issue. He's being charged for believing in the resurrection and specifically believing that Jesus is rose from the dead. Now, another interesting thing, two interesting things we see in verse 19. They had these questions of their own superstition. Now, superstition is a word to us that has a negative connotation, right? If we say, Claude is superstitious, then, he's afraid of the black cat or the ladder or the mirror or whatever it is. All of those things that are superstitions. So it would have kind of a negative connotation that we would say, it's not really based in reality. That's what superstition is today. I don't think that the Greek word meant that. And I think that, first of all, Festus likely would not have said that to Agrippa. They had these things of their own superstition. Why wouldn't he have said it to Agrippa? Because Agrippa was himself a Jew. And Agrippa at least politically, held to these beliefs. So you wouldn't come and say, I didn't get the charges I was expected, Agrippa. Actually, Agrippa, they had some of this dumb religious stuff like you believe. Now, that's not the way the conversation is going to go. So the Greek word, I don't think it has that connotation. Now, it's used one other time in the scripture, and that's Acts chapter 17, verse 22. And this is when Paul is on Mars Hill, and he says to the Athenians, men of Athens, I perceive that you are most superstitious, for you even have this, idol to an unknown God. Now, we talked about the word back then, but because that was a few sessions ago, I'll just remind you that even back then, Paul was using a word that really it's diadaimon is the word, the Greek word, diadaimon. Dia is thoroughly, and daimon, honestly, is the word from which we get demon, but at that point it didn't mean demon. It just meant spiritual. So, in a sense, Paul was saying, men of Athens, I perceive that you are thoroughly spiritual. You are so spiritual, you even have an idol to an unknown God. Now, here, again in verse 19, certain questions against him of their own superstition. That is, the deeply held religious beliefs. That's what they've got here. And then there's a second insight that we see here, and that is, he says, of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. Now, it looks like Festus has not bought into the whole resurrection thing himself. Festus seems to believe that Jesus is dead. Paul affirms him to be alive. Now, here's the issue. Okay, I wish Festus would have said, oh yes, Jesus is, up from the grave he arose with a mighty triumph for his foes, right? And broken into song there. But he didn't do that. It seems, can't fully accuse him here, but it seems like he's saying, Jesus is dead. Paul affirms him to be alive. But then, again, I'm reading a little bit between the lines. It seems that he is saying, but you can't be put to death for having a belief like that, even if we use superstition in the negative way. You can't be charged, go to jail, and be put to death for your superstitions. So all they've got against Paul is these superstitious kind of things. But now he's going to say, Paul has appealed to Caesar, and I got to send him there. And what in the world am I going to tell him? So we pick up in verse 20. And because I doubted of such manner of questions. Now, that little phrase, I doubted of such manner of questions. I think what it really means, and this comes from the Greek word doubted, but what it really means is how in the world am I supposed to investigate such a thing? I can't, there's not a law that's been broken. I can't put an agency on it to go check this thing out. It's his idea and kind of his opinion. I don't know why this came to mind right now, but I'll go ahead and spit it out there. I remember one time years ago, after a deacons meeting, I believe it was, and I'm blessed now to have wonderful deacons meetings, but this is one of those that maybe wasn't so wonderful back years ago. And the chairman of the deacons afterward spoke to me, and he said, you don't have to respond to everything that a deacon says. You can just say, thank you for sharing your opinion. It says, that's all it is their opinion. They've shared the opinion. Now, how do you investigate a person's opinion? It's kind of hard. That's just their conclusions, their feelings, their gut about it, whatever it is. And so it's almost here like Festus is saying, the Jews came with their Jewish opinion, and Paul comes with his opposing Jewish opinion. What am I supposed to do to investigate that? That's their religious opinions. They've come to their conclusion. I'm doubtful about the questions. That is, I don't even know how to cross-examine the witness here. What do I do with that? And so I think that's what we've got in verse 20. I doubted of such manner of questions. I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem and be judged of these matters. Now, we looked at that again last week when we had the full explanation of it. And verse 21, but when Paul appealed, I reserved under the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept until I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear this man myself. Tomorrow, said he, thou shalt hear him. Okay, he's just recounting the story again, the story that we looked at last week. And here's what happens. I still got this guy here. So, hey, maybe you can help me. I still got him. What am I going to do with him? He has appealed to, notice again in verse 21, to Augustus. He reserved unto the hearing of Augustus. I commanded him to be kept until I might send him to Caesar. Now, Caesar and Augustus are the same person, but just to make matters confusing in history, it's not Caesar Augustus. Caesar Augustus was what? In the days of Jesus' birth, right? And yet Caesar Augustus was not named Caesar Augustus. That is all completely a title. Caesar is master? Let's call him dictator. Okay, that's what Caesar means, is dictator. And Augustus is just the word for revered. He appealed to the revered one, and what am I going to do before I can send him on to the dictator? That's basically what it says. And as a matter of fact, we get the word August, or this month of August, for that matter. We get the word August. Here comes the leader in his august glory. So it's all purely a title. By the way, the Greek word here is Sebastus, I believe it is, something very close to Sebastus, and translated as August. Sebastus means revered, and August is the Latin word that became an English word that means revered. But if you know anyone named Sebastian, that comes from this very word right here. So the August Caesar, what am I going to do to hear him, to send him up myself? So Agrippa says, hey, I'd like to hear him. This obviously is going to be of interest to Agrippa, maybe just for the show of it. I guess there's nothing wrong with that. But I think because Agrippa really does know Jewish things. And so here's kind of an inter-Jewish issue. That's probably why Festus says, hey, Agrippa, I think you could help me out here. Help me to understand what's going on here. So he comes before Agrippa then in verses 23 through 27, where it says, on the morrow, when Agrippa was come and Bernice with great pomp and entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and the principal men of the city, at Festus's commandment, Paul was brought forth. Let me stop right there for just a moment. Here they come with great pomp. The band is playing, the banners are going, you know how it all works. Hail to the Chief begins to play, everybody stands up. And like I suppose at a state dinner, even in the United States, but certainly when you get more into royalty, the announcement of the name when a person enters into the room, and all of that stuff that is brought forth, as I think that what you have in verse 23 is that all of them entered with pomp. That is Agrippa and Bernice and the chief captains and the principal men of the city. Festus is leading them as he's putting this, and it looks to be that there is a whole crowd of people. It really is. If there's not a crowd of people, then this is the height of arrogance. Can you imagine if the president requires Hail to the Chief to be played every time he comes into the dining room to eat his hamburger? That's a little overdoing it, right? If nobody's there but the staff and got to play Hail to the Chief every time. So they've got a crowd of people, and it's these leaders that come, marching in all puffed up, and the band is playing, and their name is announced and all that, and there's great pomp, and the king comes in. It really is a public display. We think, can't totally be proven, but we think this took place in the theater in Caesarea. And the theater of Caesarea actually stands to this day. You can go see it December 1st through the 11th, Lord willing. Government willing, and you can stand there and see, where Paul would have sat, where King Agrippa and all that kind of stuff there in that theater. As a matter of fact, the seats in the theater have been restored. So because of that, they still use that theater to this day. Probably not this year, but normal years, they'll have concerts out there and things like that, overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. It's a beautiful place and a beautiful theater. And so they come in with all this pomp into the theater and begin this, not really a trial, but we'll call it a hearing. So verse 24, and Festus said, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, ye see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself hath appealed to Caesar, I have determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. Now, that's an august sounding little speech, isn't it? But basically it's a little mouse saying, I don't know what to do. I'm supposed to send him on to Caesar. He can't just show up, knock on the door and say, hey, Caesar, let me tell you what happened to me. He's got to have some official papers, and those official papers have to say something about a trial. And what in the world am I supposed to say? This guy is on trial for superstitions. You deal with it. Now, don't you think that Festus knows that Caesar is immediately going to say, you're wasting my time on this trial? If it's superstitions, then tell him we don't charge people for superstitions. So go home. So here, what we see, I think, in Festus is, again, the goal of the meeting is he needs something to write to Augustus. He needs some kind of charge against him. And what we see here is that there's nothing to charge Paul with. There's no criminality to charge Paul with. At the same time, we knew that a long time ago, didn't we? Remember, Felix, make sure I get my Felix and Festus in the right order. Felix put him on charge, found no crime, but kept him under house arrest for 2 years. Now we've got Festus, who maybe for another 2 years, somewhere 6 months to 2 years in that time period, Festus has kept him with, they had their little hearing, but nothing's taking place. So what you've got here is that he has he's arrested, but nobody knows what he's arrested for. And he's not going to be released. And in the end, again, Festus says, well, why don't we go to Jerusalem and we'll take care of this? And that puts Paul between a rock and a hard place. I can go to Jerusalem for the trial against these superstitions, but they're going to kill me if I do. Or I can sit here and rot in house arrest, I guess. And that's not any good option. So I tell you what, let's move this forward. I appeal to Caesar. He's between a rock and a hard place. He appeals to Caesar as he has the right to do, rather than take the mock trial before the Jewish leaders on superstitions or the staying in house arrest. He appeals to Caesar. Now, again, Festus really does seem to know that this whole thing is a sham. And he seems to know, I've allowed it to go on and I'm going to get myself in trouble someday. Somebody eventually is going to say, Festus, why didn't you step up and lead like you were supposed to? That seat you were sitting on is called a judgment seat. So make a judgment and let the guy go. You know that he's innocent. Why didn't you do that? So he doesn't do it. Now, I have somewhat, and I suppose I should apologize a little bit for it, I've somewhat been complimentary of the Roman government through this little transition here. It is because, again, there is a lot of Western civilization. At the heart of it, they did have a rule of law that took place, and we see some of that happening here. But at the same time, the problem with the Roman government, and maybe this was the reason for the decline of the Roman Empire, is because with all that strong rule of law, this is the way we do it. We have the Caesar, we have the Senate, we have the jury system, we have the trial, all those kind of things that were good about the fundamental principles of it. They also had this system of appeasement that was sort of baked in the cake, if you will. And I think it comes from the Roman government, as you've heard many times before, one of their philosophies for controlling the world was bread and circus. We can control whatever we want as long as we feed people and give them some entertainment. Well, that in and of itself said, make the people happy. So here was a situation in which the judgment was not going to make the people happy. And Festus was who was over the province of Judea, he was going to have all the Judeans mad at him. And so he didn't want to make the judgment. And when you mix politics and justice, you don't have it. By the way, anytime you have to hyphenate justice, you don't have justice. Whether it's political justice or economic justice or social justice, I think the only kind of justice we should want is justice, right? And here, Festus is not willing to give justice. And he doesn't want to do that because that will cause political disharmony. And so he backs off on it. Felix had done the same thing. And so he says, hey, help me here. I need something to write. So verse 27, he says, it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not without signifying the crimes against him. Once again, a little bit of Western civilization there, that it is unreasonable to arrest someone and not state the crimes against them. I think that's part of American jurisprudence, isn't it? That you have to be charged of something or they have to let you go. They can't keep you under house arrest indefinitely. Let me say that differently. Before March of 2020, they could not keep you under house arrest indefinitely. Now the Caesar herself can make an ordinance, an order that keeps you under house arrest, right? Sorry, I'm getting into preaching instead of just preaching. But, you know, the word, I like the word there, for it seemeth to me unreasonable. The word unreasonable is the Greek word alagos. Now, we get the word illogical from logos. Logos is the word for speech, but it often was used in the sense, as it is here, was used in the sense of reason, thought. We even get the English word logic out of logos. And the Greek letter A, of course, cancels it all out. So what it really says, it seems to me to be without logic to keep him further without saying what crimes he had done. And indeed it is. In fact, maybe what is most unreasonable or most illogical is that Paul has already been kept in prison again. Has it been 2 years, 3 years, 4 years? He's had a number of trials already. Started out in Jerusalem when he was arrested, you remember, and then before Felix at least. In fact, I think there was really several of those hearings. Maybe not a trial, but a hearing before Lucius, the chief captain of the Jews in Jerusalem, and then he goes to Caesarea and he stands before Felix. And a number of times during 2 years he comes and Felix and Paul have these conversations going on together. And then Felix gets taken out of office and Festus comes in and he's had this trial before Festus and he's sat there rotting in house arrest in Caesarea all of this time. That seems unreasonable, doesn't it? And yet again, the problem was there. Well, I thought I would get down to into the beginning of Paul standing before Agrippa, but I'm not going to get into that. But we will pick up there at chapter 26, verse 1. And verse 8 was kind of an odd place to stop anyway. I just thought I would make it farther, but I told too many stories. So next week, chapter 26, we're going to see Paul before Agrippa. He is going to say, I am very happy to stand before you, Agrippa, and to share this with you. The reason he's happy is, as I hinted at earlier, Agrippa really does know Jewish religion. He knows Jewish things. Festus, Felix, they were not Jews. They were Romans. They were governors of the Jewish province by appointment. They were trying to, handle it all, but they didn't understand the ins and outs of it, as we've seen from this passage. So what he's saying is, finally, somebody who can make a judgment and who does know about Jewish superstitions, to use the word that is used there. So he's happy to stand before Agrippa. We'll see how it goes when he is before Agrippa and his wife. I don't know if his wife was there or not, but Bernice, his sister, was there. And we'll leave it at that. Maybe his wife and his sister were there. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for, giving us this inspired account of history and what has taken place. And we just pray that we have been faithful to the text and faithful to understanding it. As we, in a moment, go into our worship service today, we also ask that you would encourage not only these who are here, but these who join us online. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We will